Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of ChinaRemix. I am your host, Lizzi C, a fellow on Chinese economy at ASPI Center for China Analysis. Today, we're talking about a Chinese animation movie, Ne Zha 2. If you haven't been following, this animated epic has smashed records, pulling in over 2 billion US dollars and surpassing Avengers Endgame in IMAX earnings in China. Some are even saying it could be China's biggest cultural export of the year. To help us break all down, I have Aladin Farré with me. He is a producer based between Beijing and Paris, and he's also the host of Middle Earth, China's cultural industry podcast. He really knows the ins and outs of China's film industry. Aladin, welcome. So glad to have you here.
Well, hi, good morning, Lizzie. Here it's the evening in Beijing. I'm just back from a shoot actually that took a week, so I hope I won't be too tired for your listeners. And thank you for having me.
And thank you so much. It's already pretty late Beijing time, but thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me. But let's get started. And let's start from the beginning. For those in our audience who have not seen Ne Zha 2, what's the story about and how does it build on Ne Zha 1?
Okay, so first of all, I of course want to acknowledge that as a French person, I've been living in Beijing for more than 8 years, but I was not grown up on those story because Ne Zha is actually, so I will try to explain as best on my abilities, but I did not grow up on those stories. So Ne Zha is actually based on, the movie is based on a character, an IP as we call it in the field, based from the book of the Ming Dynasty called Investor of the God, Fang Shen Yan Yi. And the story happens during the Shang Dynasty, which is more than 3,000 years ago. And it basically tells the story. I mean, Ne Zha is one of the characters in those books, but in the movies, he becomes one of the main protagonists. And basically, he's kind of your anti-hero, I would say. Like he's, first of all, like he's the reincarnation of some demonic power, making it that he was supposed to be a normal baby, but then he becomes this kind of semi-god-like creature, and then he's really mischievous and things like that. And so the movie Ne Zha 2 comes after it came out this year, which is a massive success. Came out after Ne Zha 1, Ne Zha back in 2019, which was already a big success in its own name. And yeah, I guess the producer wanted to make the story go on. So the story would basically the story, it's the kind of, if I may, it's not to spoil anything, but it's the typical animation story of, the character goes through challenges and has to learn how to use his power and things like that. And it's solely based on the book. They kind of took the characters and make them go through fighting scene and journey and adventure and things like that. So it's a loosely what's the word? Sorry, it's kind of loose on the reinterpretation, but the movies are great. I've seen them both, and they really deserve their box office.
Fantastic. As you mentioned, Ne Zha is such a legendary character in Chinese mythology. He is very rebellious, he's powerful, and he's challenging authority. But can you talk a little more about how do you think Ne Zha symbolizes, or what it symbolizes in Chinese culture? Why has he remained such a compelling figure for centuries in different renditions in books and TV series and movies?
I think, and again, like I think that would be a bit hard for me to answer on. Like I think, like for this, someone who has a sociological background would be a little bit more fit to answer the question. But I think the character and a little bit like Wukong is kind of a nice character that I think audience and maybe kids especially want to associate with, because he's like such a mischievous person. And also, yeah, Ne Zha is part of, not only is he part of the book that was written 100 years ago, which I'm sure I can't put any claim on that, but I'm sure like that has made that back then those were based on folk stories that must have been there for thousands of years. And then also Ne Zha, it's interesting because it's not just like a fiction character; it's also a patron, like a bit in the saint. For example, so Ne Zha would be, for example, the patron for truck drivers, and that would be the similar things of Saint Christopher in Catholic countries, where Saint Christopher would be the patron of the travelers. So it's interesting to see that Ne Zha is not just like a fictionless character; he's also someone might been someone who is like deeply ingrained into the folk and the social stories of China. I would think that also it's also a perfect storm, because also the reason the movie becomes so good is that I think you should really see it as I guess everyone who's watched Kung Fu Panda could think that it's kind of a similar kind of story arc, in the sense of it's a witty character which is famous, everyone knows it, but then the story itself, like they really make great use of the character, and it's epic, and it's also really funny at the same time. So I think that's why it would push so many people to go and see the movie.
Fantastic. And, visually, I find the way Ne Zha 2 merges ancient Chinese aesthetics with cutting edge animation is really stunning. How important do you think it is that this film feels like a showcase of Chinese mythology using modern technology? Is it part of why it's so popular among China's domestic audience?
Yeah, I think they are doing a really good job regarding this. I'm sure we can put this on the show notes, but as we were preparing for the show, I was watching, trying to find like behind the scene documentaries, and there's like a great documentary made on Bilibili. So, you can see like the team working on creating that. And yeah, they're definitely using the latest technology tools. I work more on film production and documentary, so it's not so much on animation. But yeah, you can really sense that they really worked really hard to make just the best production available possible. The budget is more than $100 million. So they made the best of their abilities and the technology that was available.
Fantastic. And as you sort of alluded to, the story was also a tweak on the original story. They actually took the original mythology and changed it. And Ne Zha is not what we usually, or not the version that we read in original, Feng Shen Yan Yi. Can you talk a little bit more about, without giving us sort of further details, can you talk a little more about how that original story has been tweaked?
I mean, without spoiling too much, I think that's interesting that, for example, in the original story, like Ne Zha really get one of his arch enemy is Ao Bing, which but then during the story, during the current movies, he actually become his friend. We'll see how that moves on because I'm sure there are going to be Ne Zha 3 and Ne Zha 4, and I'm sure they are going to keep using this IP and maybe make some kind of Marvel universe. But I think that's interesting that they decided not to just like retake the story itself, but try to tweak it and go their own way. And I think maybe that's why it might be popular, because then maybe that's a new take on the character itself.
Fantastic. And especially in international media, there seems to be this narrative that Ne Zha 2 is not just a hit, it's a symbol of China's national pride. And we've seen evidence of Chinese state media and audience kind of rallying around it. How much of this movie's success do you think is about cultural confidence, so to speak? Is it part of a bigger shift in how China and Chinese audience sees itself in an entertainment world?
I find this really interesting because, especially me as a French, we're also a really proud country where it comes to our culture, and we'll be the first one to say things like, "Oh, people from America, they don't have any history," and then the Chinese would say the same thing, but they have a even longer recorded history. But personally, I never really fully understand this cultural confidence thing, in the sense of, I don't know, to requote Game of Thrones, when one of the Lannister says like, "Any man who must say I am the king is no true king," and I think this kind of plays a bit like this, like, if any of your cultural products are good and are interesting and are attractive, then people will just go flock to them. Like, you don't need to push them as much as you can. And again, we will have to see the number on that later regarding how Ne Zha, because Ne Zha is being played now in some theater all across the globe. But to my understanding, most of the time it's for mostly local Chinese population who want to see the movie that are being played in China. And typically those kind of movie, to give you a rough estimate, but roughly most of the time those big Chinese blockbusters, they would make like 95 to 99% of their money in China, and then they would only make like a tiny margin of 1, 2, 3% in global theater. So I think as long as the numbers stay the same, like I'm not sure how we can really talk about a cultural export, because at the same time, if you look at Hollywood movie, they make 1/3 of their money in the US and 70% to the rest of the world. So I think like as long as we have this dynamic, I'm not sure, yeah, if we can talk about like a cultural success going abroad.
Yeah, but speaking of this idea of national pride, we've seen something similar in cultural product coming from China in this year, right? So starting with the game Black Myth Wukong, which I know you also focus on a lot. In social media trends, right? On social media platforms and Xiaohongshu, and even in fashion. Would you say we're sort of in the middle of a Chinese cultural renaissance, so to speak?
I think we're definitely something happening which is very interesting. And when I came to China, definitely this was not part of the conversation. But I think what we're seeing is, I don't know if I would call it a renaissance, but what I would call it is that I think what we're seeing is basically the same thing that happens with cars and electronic equipment. So because you should know that for the listeners, like actually people who produce Ne Zha and people who have created Black Myth Wukong, for example, all those people, all those studios, and if you look at the credits of Ne Zha, there are like, I think at least 50 small companies who I guess each of them have like their own tiny part to make this gigantic machine work and make this great movie. And all of those people, all of those workers, for actually the last decades have actually been like externalized, Waibao, from Hollywood studio and video game company from Japan and the US and Europe. And they would actually be the assembly worker, exactly like maybe their father or their mother and their cousin, like in the 90s and 2000, when you had like so many foreign products, international product being made in China. And kind of the same story repeated itself with mostly 3D effects and video game, where you would have like maybe the main creative team would be in the US, but then most of the people making the game itself, like the 3D artist, would be in India, China, Indonesia, and so on. And so those people then at some point they learn how to make cultural product that are on international standard, and then they could just reapply the formula, and then they make movie like Ne Zha, which are like that can really stand the comparison with a Disney or a Pixar movie.
And this really sort of reminds me of Black Myth Wukong, the first AAA title. There seems to be this quality upgrade in terms of the kind of cultural product China can make. What does it mean for Chinese filmmakers? Does Ne Zha 2's success change what kind of movies get made in China going forward? Does it reset Chinese filmmakers' ambitions and expectations?
I think it definitely will give some confidence, because from my conversation with my peers here in Beijing, like, and I can really sense like the past 2 years have been really tougher on people. Like projects have been canceled. Before even before COVID, like you would have a lot of people going on shoots all across the globe to make their series or their TV shows, and now like you can really sense like people are just spending less money. There are less budget flying around. There are still projects, and some movies like How Dong-si recently, which is a, let's say, feminist story, had like a nice box office that doesn't compare to Ne Zha, but that's another story. And I think like it would at least give the confidence of some producer to trust a little bit more the creative and to give times, because it's interesting, like Ne Zha 2, like it took them 5 years to come up with a new movie. And I think that's interesting that they give it time. They didn't push a new movie within 2 years or 1 year. And I think that we had to wait almost 5 years, more than 5 years to watch Ne Zha 2. I think will prove that you must have more standard and focus on quality, so that then you can have a nice number in the box office.
Long-term investment, patience is key. But there is another layer to this too. I mean, China's box office, as you mentioned, has had a rough couple of years with COVID and, with the economy still trying to find a footing today. Um, do you think Ne Zha 2 is a sign that China's entertainment industry is finally bouncing back? Or do you think it's more of a one-off success?
I think first of all, also it's for Ne Zha 2 to have such a perfect to have a perfect box office. It's also because this is the time of the year during Chinese New Year is actually the most profitable time ever for any filmmakers to make their movie there. Because I'm sure your listeners all know, during the Chinese New Year, we have in China like roughly a week. So what happens is that people go to see their family, they are, having a good time. And then after the third day, people, it is like a family gathering. And after the third day, when everyone wants to murder each other and, there's like old wounds being reopened and so on, then people are like, why don't we go to the cinema and do like a family activities all together? And so during Chinese New Year, it's like the moment when you have the most family friendly kind of really easy kind of stories that can be put. And Ne Zha is definitely a film that everyone can watch between 7 to 77 and 97. So I think that was like a great moment to have this. So I don't think there are going to be maybe there will be other Ne Zha doing almost doing 1.6 billion in the box office, but that won't happen all the time. But that will definitely that will give confidence to the market, I'm sure. But to give another counterexample, like we had a function, Diarbu, like which is based on the same stories, actually on the same book that came up. There was also the second installation of that same IP, and this one actually tanked. I mean, in the sense of people were really mad at the way the filmmakers made that second movie. So yeah, we have good stories, but we also have bad stories happening during the same box office week.
Fantastic. And just speaking of this domestic market, this timing, this Chinese New Year moment, if I'm reading it correctly, for years, I mean, Hollywood basically dominated China's premier animated film box office. But now, if you look at the top charts, it's mostly domestic films that are at the very front. Do you think Hollywood has lost its edge in China, or is it more about growing local competition coming out of China?
I think, well, if we're looking at animated film, like I mentioned a bit before, like definitely the workers, the people creating those animated movies in China, like at some point, like the knowledge gets there. They know how to make a quality movie. And then if you just put a good script, I mean, good scripts are hard to come by in the first place, but if you manage to find a good script, and then if you put it on and slap it on some kind of IP that everyone knows, like some old folktale legend, because Ne Zha stories has been said, like you said in the introduction, like it's been a lot of movies and TV shows have already talked about it. So and it's the books and it's part of the folklore, so everyone knows that. Like if you have all those three elements combined, like I think that's definitely why people would go see, a Chinese animated film. Like it would make sense, but that doesn't mean like a Pixar movie won't be seen in China. I remember Coco was also like a massive hit back in the day, and it really resonated with the audience here. So I'm sure there are like still, dear Hollywood executive, I'm sure there are still like space for everyone, for the Chinese markets.
Fantastic. Probably just not another Fast and Furious, right? Because we are pretty tired of those. But what does it mean for Chinese movies influencing Hollywood reversely? Is it possible we'll see more co-productions or even more kind of Chinese-inspired storytellings in mainstream Western cinema?
I think, I mean, if I would bet my money on something like this, I wouldn't say that co-production is still the way forward. I mean, co-production is one of the hardest form of filmmaking because you can more easily co-produce a TV show or a documentary or an animation because, like we've seen, because Ne Zha, what's interesting is actually part of the many studios that you can see in the box office. Actually, some of them are from India. I mean, they don't say the location, but when you read the name, you can understand that those people must surely come from India. So in terms of, and in terms of, again, the story, I think Ne Zha is really good story. It's pretty well made. But if you would just like send it to people who've never watched any never read any Chinese book or are not interested in China, I think that's really hard take to start, because you have so many backstories that you wouldn't know. I mean, even for Chinese audience, like sometimes like they have to put the name of the characters on screen so that people in the audience understand like who's this character is. So if you imagine, if you do this for Chinese audience, like I can't even imagine like you would need like a PPT presentation deck to present like this character from Ne Zha to international audience. So I think there are still like, I guess, growth in terms of maybe sometimes, some people put money into a movie and then they don't have to actually put their own characters or their own culture into the movie. And that could be like one way for production and co-production to move forward. But at the end of the day, like it's still really hard. Like, and I think like people back then in the 2010s thought they could like, put like a Chinese actor onto an American film and sell it in China. Most of the time it didn't materialize. People went to see a movie that they liked and that's it. Didn't need to have Fan Bingbing in it to go buy a ticket. And I think people here now are more and more, astute and educated into like quality filmmaking. So therefore, I think co-production might not be the way forward. And I really don't see, Chinese movie crossing the Pacific to sell tons of tickets in the US in the current firm. Maybe at some point they will work more on, maybe more easily to be understood stories for international audience. But I think we're not there yet.
Fantastic. And finally, let's talk a little bit about strategy. So, if you are a Hollywood studio executive listening to this and watching our episode, and you want your movie to succeed in China, what is the biggest mistake or lesson that foreign studios make or take when they try to enter the Chinese market?
So I think, yeah, like I mentioned before, so they would try to kind of this approach of making like sometimes like a Chinese cut. Would it be with putting a little bit more content with a Chinese star in it, or maybe reducing some minutes of the film? Like I remember Logan, for example, where I think they had to take out like 7 minutes due to local regulation because it was maybe a little bit too bloody. But I mean, so if you are a Hollywood executive, and again, like to re-put again some perspective, like because until now China has like what we call a quota system. So if you have like a co-production, you can actually, and you're then a Chinese partner, and you have a Chinese partner, then you can put more easily your movie into the cinema. But then if you are just like a 100% international movie, to go into the Chinese market, then you need to go through more hoops. And then there are like some period, like during Chinese New Year, for example, where it's better there will only be like a Chinese movie to support the local economy, which I think is not bad in itself, because, some countries like Italy basically got their filmmaking industry basically being wiped out by Hollywood. So, and compared to France, where the government managed to protect a little bit more, or creative industry back in the 50s and 60s. So I think it's good sometimes, like maybe to have like some help for local producers so that they can be able to have like a market where they can tap into it and, make movies and try things and then make a better film the time after. So I mean, I think it's just the easy answer to this. Maybe it's really simple, but it's just like, I think wherever you are in this planet, like people will want to watch good film, and you don't have to try to cater to audiences and put like an actress or a famous actor. I think it won't, and I think it won't work. Like if it really fits the story, then that will work. But then it's because the story is good in the first place. And I think we've seen like we've seen, and with all the trade war and so on, like there is obviously like a bigger picture, which is more important than movies. But I think like the formula itself has kind of dwindled down, and now it's just about focusing on good stories. And for example, like a couple months ago, Alien Romulus that came out in Chinese cinema, and then that time there was no cut of anything, even though that movie is pretty bloody. But that movie, for instance, like made more than 100 million in Chinese box office. It really pushed the movie to, have a good box office internationally. But at the end of the day, that movie was from the IP Alien that I don't recall any of the movie before came out in China. A bit like Star Wars, for example, when Star Wars came out into the third trilogy in 2015, like it really bombed in Chinese box office because people didn't know Star Wars. Like that, there was such a massive backlog of stories and backstories and lore to understand that, a little bit like a reverse Ne Zha, if you would. So, but when Alien Romulus came out in China, it really worked well because it's just a really good horror flick, and people went to see it. And so yeah, just do more Alien Romulus, I guess.
Such a dynamic and also very complicated market for us to understand. And it's also slowly emerging and evolving, and people's tastes are getting more educated and sophisticated. And what is quality content to the Chinese audience's taste? It's a tricky question, as you mentioned. Aladin, thank you so much for joining me today. This was such an insightful conversation. And to our audience, let us know, have you watched Ne Zha 2 yet? What do you think? Please drop a comment, tag us on social media, and do not forget to subscribe to this channel. We'll see